That was delirious. I could sing of your love forever here on 94.9. It is 17 minutes past 4, and it's that time of day for Creation Ministries International. And on the line, I have Dr. Ron Neller from Queensland. Good afternoon, Dr. Ron.
Good afternoon, Mick. How are you?
Great. It's great to have you on again. It's been quite a while since we spoke last.
It has. I'd say a couple of years.
Yes, quite possibly. Now, of course, Dr. Ron, he has a BA Honours and a PhD, both in fluvial geomorphology. Now, before I go any further, Dr. Ron, can you tell us what fluvial geomorphology is?
Yeah, geomorphology is essentially the study of the Earth's surface. Now, I might ask questions of why that hill is there, or why that floodplain is there, or why these erosional processes are occurring. So essentially looking at the landscapes. And I particularly was interested in the floods and how they were creating landscapes.
Right. Now, it's interesting for somebody in your field of science to be working with Creation Ministries International. Of course, you know, spruiking creation rather than evolution, yet you've been studying how the Earth has evolved, essentially. Is that what they taught you at university?
They did. It was a paradigm that they accepted, a way of thinking that the Earth had evolved over millions of years. And I accepted that on day one as a graduate. But as I travelled the world and as I did research in multiple continents, I saw another picture, a picture of a much younger Earth, and one that had been subject to a catastrophic global flood.
Yeah. And when did you become a Christian?
I actually gave my life to Christ at about the age of 55, when I truly accepted him. I had been to church before on a few occasions, but I only gave my life to Christ at about 55, and that was after many, many years of research in science, and it kept pointing back to the Bible, and in the end I had to make a decision then. Where does the science point? Does it point to Bible, or does it point to the thinking of evolution? And just from a scientific point of view, I said, no, it points to the Bible.
Wow. And what sort of science caused you to, change your mind, I guess?
I guess it was, as I was travelling the world and interacting with many scientists, whether they be archaeologists or fossil hunter, paleontologists, those sort of people, I kept seeing a connection between them that pointed to a much younger Earth and a Earth that had been torn apart. And so I think it was the interaction by looking globally, seeing patterns of evidence that were not just local, they were global, and interacting with many other scientists helped me come to that particular decision.
Wow, interacting with other scientists. Other Christian scientists or just all sorts of scientists?
No, they were not Christian scientists. I think there were one or two at the time, but that I didn't pay much attention to that. I was simply looking at the scientific elements and asking questions then regarding, well, how does fossilization really occur? Where does the sediment come from? All these sorts of questions. I couldn't get reliable answers. I also couldn't get particular scientists agreeing with each other.
Yep.
So I carved my own pathway.
Wow. Now, Dr. Ron, you've published an article on creation.com, which is a website that Creation Ministries International manage and look after. There's literally thousands of pages of information on there. Now, let me just mention right now too, whilst people can go to creation.com to get their questions answered, if you have any questions for Dr. Ron, right now, we'd love you to send them through to us. Just text us 0401 949 949. Now, Dr. Ron, this particular article that you wrote was called Fossils in a Day. Now, of course, we've heard many times on TV, you just turn the TV on, if they're talking about anything old, they talk about fossils that, took a long time to make, I guess, from a dead body of something into a fossil takes a long time. What is fossils in a day?
Well, fossils in a day was actually, I wrote a paper on an experiment that was being undertaken quite regularly. And that experiment, they were trying to in a sense, create fossils rapidly within a 24-hour period. That's called a maturation experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And so what they would do is they'd take a leaf or a feather or small piece of an animal or lizard, something like that, and they would actually then place that in a sealed capsule and then put a lot of heat and pressure on it and then open it up 24 hours later hoping to see a fossil, because the pressure would represent the depth of sediment perhaps and the temperature also. Now, it needs more change than that, but it's just an interesting experiment that went on for many, many years. But that experiment over those many years failed time and time again until one day they decided to change something.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that thing they changed was when they were placing these, let's say, lizard parts or leaf parts in between the two and putting them under pressure. The next day, all those molecules that were relatively unstable or those molecules that should have evaporated were still trapped inside the holding capsule. And as a result, the rubbish was a spongy mush type material.
Yeah.
So what they decided to do was a novel approach. They decided to put that, let's say, organic specimen in some clay or some sediment, easily compacted clay. Then they apply the pressure to the clay with the organism in it. And when they opened those up 24 hours later, they were stunned. They had basically replicated fossilization within 24 hours. And it turned out that it was the sediment that was the key.
So some of these images that I'm looking at from that particular paper you've written, there's an image of a lizard. It looks like it's on clay blocks. And when I say image, it really does look like something that comes from, some geologist has found it in a rock that's been there for 1 million years, or they say, or they would have said, had been there for 1 million years. You're saying that was done in a day?
It was done in a day because, mind you, it was placed under incredible pressure and temperature, which would, in a sense, fast-track time. But the key element there is the fact that they had to put it into a sediment, a clay, something like that, because it was the sediment that absorbed those molecules that shouldn't stick around, the ones that were unstable or should have evaporated. The sediment actually absorbed that, allowing then true fossilization to occur. Now, it's more complicated than that. The point that really hit me hard, though, was that, as we know, fossils are found in sediments. They're found in sedimentary rocks. So they were laid down, they died, and were buried in sediment. And that sediment then actually allowed fossilization to occur.
Yeah.
And so without the sediment, basically you don't get the fossils most of the time. So the thing that caught me off guard, to come to the point there, was the amount of sediment that would have been needed to create a fossil is immense.
Yeah.
And we just don't see that today. Whether you're on the ocean floors, continental shelves, river basins, you do not see sediment being deposited in layers so deep, so rapidly that they would actually create fossils before the organism became a mushy, degraded mess.
Well, we've got to go into a little break right now. What we might do when we come back from this break, Dr. Ron, is we'll talk about what must have happened to those particular animals to create the fossils. You are on 94.9. It's 26 minutes past 4. We've got Toby Mack and Zach Williams up next with Corners. And we have Dr. Ron Neller on the line from Creation Ministries International. And he's been talking to us today about fossils and fossils in a day and how they've created fossils in a day. But they say to create fossils, they have to be pretty much encased in silt, like clay. And Dr. Ron, I think we were almost getting to that point of saying, well, where does it all come from? I'm assuming it comes from a flood. That's one way, of course, you can get a whole lot of clay in one place at one time. I'm wondering, though, how the evolutionists say these fossils were created.
Well, that's a good question. I feel it's an elephant in the room at the moment. where the rate of sedimentation does not explain our fossil record. But I'll go back a step there. I mean, the element that when they put those lizards or leaves in sediment, it was very simple, as they put it in their own words. The liquids or the unstable molecules leaked into the sediment, allowing the fossilization to occur. In other words, if the molecules, unstable molecules or liquid, are kept in a body, and that's what we're made of, really, it's water. If that's kept in our body, we cannot fossilize. It has to be removed. So to remove that in a short period of time, because it is a short period of time, if we do not remove the water from our bodies in a short period of time, we will decompose. We'll simply rot.
Yeah.
And so...
And we can't leave those patterns then, can we?
That's right. We won't leave those. We'll leave it, as these authors said, just a mush, a liquid mush. And so what we do, what came out of that study, they didn't really explore this, but it certainly had an impact on me that the amount of sediment, particularly the depth of it or the weight of sediment needed to create fossils, then has to be quite considerable. And being a person who had travelled the world and measured sediment in so many different environments, sediment transport, the sediment deposited, I was just caught between a rock and a hard place. If sediment is needed to create fossils, then where is the sediment in the amount needed to create fossils? We just don't see it today in any environment.
I mean, when you were in your travels, sort of looking at all these different fossils, of course, you go to different sites where I guess someone sort of dug something up and they've gone, oh, here's a fossil of something. This one's 1 million years old. This one's 100,000 years old. Now, look, if the evolutionary tale were true, there'd have to be some that they go, oh, this one's only 20 years old.
Good point. And there's our problem. In searching for fossils being created today, we actually basically don't find any.
Why?
They might be human-made, or in a iron or a cave or something like that. But studies I've picked up on suspect that the only fossils being created today would only be molecules in the ocean floor. What I'm getting at there is today, no matter where you are, as I think I mentioned before, whether you're on the ocean floor or continental shelf or you're even in a tsunami, the amount of sediment deposited is such a low depth over large areas. The maximum would get to is about 10 centimetres. That is not to create, that will not create a fossil. It's not enough. So as paleontologists search the world today looking for fossils being created, we basically don't find them. So then the question has to be asked, well, if they're not being created today, then under what conditions were they created?
Yep.
Which then makes a significant hole in the evolutionary argument where they say that the past is the same as today and the same as the future. How do we interpret the past? We look at today's processes and we then go back in time and say, oh, yes, that's what happened in the past. But if we're not creating fossils today, then how did we create them in the past?
Yes.
That's a real problem with the evolutionary argument. It's called uniformitarianism. Today is the same as the past, the same as tomorrow.
Yeah.
So we should be creating fossils today, and we're not.
Absolutely. Now, last week, we were sort of chatting with Mark James, and we were talking about land bridges, like even stuff like down at the 12 Apostles and, some of these amazing sort of rocky outcrops that we see that are falling down, but we're not seeing any new ones being created. And now we're talking about fossils. We're seeing fossils being found that they say are, very old and trying to pick dates very old, but they're not saying there's any new ones being created. So again, we're looking at something completely different, but we've come to the same conclusion that under current conditions, these things can't happen. And really, a great flood is, well, from my point of view, it seems like the only possible way that these things could possibly happen. And that, of course, you're saying masses of sediment. You're saying huge weight, huge pressure is required to create these fossils. And that just can't happen today.
That's correct. Absolutely correct. We're not seeing evidence of it anywhere. We're not seeing sedimentary deposits of any magnitude that you'd even inspect and try to find a fossil being created. We just don't see it anywhere. So that's what led me then to look towards the Bible, because the Bible described an event in history that could have created fossils.
Yeah.
But I was seeing no scientific evidence today of fossils being created, neither the fossils themselves, nor the sedimentary records needed to create the fossils, nor the floods of significant magnitude sufficient to drive lots of sediment. But the Bible pointed to an event in the past.
And you would know, a PhD in fluvial geomorphology, you would know. Now, Dr. Ron, we've just had a question come through on our text line. And if anybody has any other questions, please don't forget 0401 949 949 is the text line. But this question is, Dr. Ron, what sort of depth of sediment or pressure is required to create a fossil?
That's an excellent question, and it's one we don't have a definite answer, but there is research ongoing at the moment. I've got a colleague friend in Japan who's doing some work trying to get monies to, in a sense, work with engineering and paleontological and translate pressure into depth of sediment, but then equally you've got to incorporate time into that experiment as well. So you'd have to run that experiment over different lengths of time with different sets of pressure and different temperatures to look at the interaction of all of those factors together. So great question. It's only really being raised as a result of that article a couple of years ago, that sediment is needed and it needs to be under pressure. So excellent question, but I'm sorry to the person who asked that question. We don't have a definitive answer at this stage.
And I assume that's because you need so much. It's a big experiment. Like, you can imagine in a catastrophic flood, a massive flood where the entire planet was flooded, the oceans would have been raging. There's a lot of stuff being moved around on the ocean floor. There's a lot of silt, there's a lot of dirt, there's a lot of everything moving. And as you're saying, even in, big tsunamis, all sorts of things, you're only going to get like 10 centimetres of sediment. Is there anything else in your, being a PhD in geomorphology, you must have seen some other possible way for sediment to build up?
Not of a level that would be required for fossilization. I have sampled extreme floods, for example, 100-year floods, even 500-year floods by their frequency, and so their magnitude is quite high. But even those floods have minimal impact on the landscape, and so you're left with this, daunting question: well, how do these floods carve the landscape that we see today? And I came to the opposite conclusion, that these rivers are simply occupying a landscape that was already carved by a bigger flood. And I see that in so many ways now, and I'm publishing more articles on that now, that we look at it as though rivers carved this landscape. I'm going to argue that this landscape has rivers in it that are the remains of a massive catastrophic event, and particularly the gigantic rates of flow that came off the landscape as the landscape was raised. Yep. As the Lord said, I will raise the land. And as it did, the water flowed off, but not evenly. It actually would form clusters. It would actually form together. It would create canyons, all sorts of things would be, because the water would flow in concentrated patterns off the landscape, and so on. But the sediment, and when you comment on the sediment around the planet, easily reaches 12 kilometres deep in places. And I think overall it sits at about 2 kilometres thick on average around the planet.
Wow.
If you were to average it, it'd be about 2 kilometres. Now, no amount of monitoring that I've done over all those years in the most extreme events, and I've worked in the Amazon, I've worked in the polar regions in Finland, and I've worked in tropical regions and temperate regions like China and Australia and so on. And no, you just don't see massive sediment movement in any of those. So regardless of the climate and regardless of the severity of the incident, you just don't see sediment moving in a volume and an amount to induce fossilization.
When I was at high school in about year 7, I can remember we were meant to be doing a scripture class, and our scripture teacher didn't turn up, so our English teacher took scripture. And instead of teaching us from the Bible, she taught us from what she thought was right. And she started talking about how she reckons there was probably just a whole heap of little floods in different places on the planet. Now, from what you're saying, there's pretty much no way that a lot of little floods could ever do what has been done to the earth.
There's lots of lines of evidence that say, and we do know that a little flood can deposit a little amount of sediment. But we also know then that the moment that flood has deposited that sediment begins to get rearranged by what we call biotubation. Plants immediately start to grow on there, organisms immediately start to dig it up and so on. And so you'll notice that on a beach or on a floodplain when new sediment is put down, within just days, you'll start to see the whole surface be remodeled, if you like, or remapped. But when you look at these sedimentary layers, say in cliff faces, they are beautifully perfect layers that have not been touched by organic material or wind erosion or gully erosion. They're just beautiful, wonderful, largely parallel layers that may be tilted up, it doesn't matter. But the point is they're lovely layers and they're not disturbed. Now, when somebody says to me it's many layers put down one after the other, I'm going to ask them, well, what happened between when one layer was put down and the other layer was put down? Was there no rain? Was there no organisms? Was there no wind? And that layer remained absolutely perfect for 6 months until another small flood came and put another layer on top. That just doesn't make sense because that's not what we see in the field. We see an immediate layer put down is automatic, is within days is turned over and essentially infiltrated by organisms.
Yeah, in which case there'd be like hundreds of I guess the remains of what would have been the mush rather than the
That's right.
But you don't see that either. You just see these pure flat sort of sections.
That's right. You would expect to find high organic content in those layers when they, touching. And I'll argue in some of those layers that they might be millions of years apart in time. This layer here, then the one immediately above it might be 12 million years difference in time.
Yeah.
But they're still perfectly flat layers, so nothing happened for 12 million years.
Yeah.
That's what catches me off guard. I was taught that when I was young in university, that it was a slow process. But my experiences worldwide in those different climatic zones and different severity of events, different catastrophes, don't indicate that at all.
All right. Well, again, we're looking at the only option is the flood, Noah's flood. Dr. Ron Neller, I thank you for being with us this week. Our time is up. It is 10 minutes to 5, but I thank you so much and look forward to speaking with you the next time.
My pleasure. Look forward as well.
I believe it's about the 7th of May for anyone that wants to know. And if you have any questions for Dr. Ron, 7th of May, we'll be chatting again. You are on 94.9. It's 10 minutes to 5.